Maggie has lost sleep over it, so. Okay, good morning, and thank you for your patience as we've gotten set up with our tech here. For those who don't know me, my name is Greg Bonfilio, and I have the great privilege actually to be pastor here at St. Ignatius. So welcome to all of you. It's good to have new faces and familiar faces here this morning. Very happy that you've joined us, because this is we're thrilled to bring back a good friend of St. Ignatius Parish, Chris White, from the National Catholic Reporter. Before I introduce Chris, just a few words about the National Catholic Reporter. First, a disclaimer, and I said this last year, is that I'm a subscriber and a faithful reader, so I'm a bit biased. I read Chris's columns and Michael Sean Winter's columns regularly, and I'm also always eager to see the insights that Mary McGlone offers about the weekly scriptures. Okay, so you're nodding your heads, which means I can't take those wholesale because you've read them already earlier in the week. And I'm a donor to the NCR, and I encourage you to be as well. I think if you read the NCR, you'll agree that without a doubt it's one of the most important journalistic voices in the Catholic, U.S. Catholic world. And some could, I think, fairly argue that is the most important one. Particularly, I think, because it's the only independent Catholic publication. Everyone else, even America Magazines, is somewhat beholden to the Society of Jesus. So it's known for its journalistic integrity, never fearing to shine a light in the darkness, either on the left or the right, both. And there are times, I will confess, that when I read the NCR, I feel my own ox as a member of the hierarchy, or as a Jesuit, my own ox gets gored, and I think, that's not fair. Which tells me that the NCR is doing its job, frankly. Again, journalistic integrity. So as you can tell, I'm a fan. I'm also a great fan of Chris, our speaker today. As you know, he's the Vatican correspondent for the NCR. And in a relatively short time on that particular beat, Chris has become a well-respected and a well-liked journalist, including among his colleagues. Chris has an ability to get even the most difficult stories through his interviews, particularly perhaps on the podcast that he does with another friend of ours, Josh McElwee, also from the NCR. They're able to get stories that are hard to get, and often the two of them break a little bit of news. Chris offers a unique perspective that I think readers won't find elsewhere in other Catholic publications. And Chris has an ability to bring delight and fun to his readers by the way he writes and the angles he takes. So the format today, Chris will speak. For how long are you speaking-ish?
I'll start 20 minutes or so.
All right. And then we'll turn it over to you to ask questions as we always do. So please welcome our friend Chris White.
Good morning. It's great to be back here at St. Ignatius. I hope you're not offended when I say I've started calling this my West Coast parish, so it's good to be. I want to thank Father Greg and Lisa and everyone at SI for making it possible for me to be back here. I really hope you're all aware of just how lucky you are to call this place home. So another applause from me to you. So. I believe many of you were here in the fall when my colleague Josh McElwee spoke. Show of hands if you were here. Great, that all means you're all subscribers to our podcast that Father Greg mentioned. Our podcast is the Vatican Briefing, and we started it as a bit of an experiment during the Synod. And I'm not very good with technology, as you just witnessed. Fortunately, Josh is, but we started this again, very quickly in the early stages of the Synod to begin to explore a new medium of storytelling during those crazy weeks in Rome during the Synod. And so we did this ad hoc, and we recorded it from the tiny office in my apartment in Rome. which we refer to as the Annette Lamont Studio. And we've named it after our most faithful listener and your wonderful parishioner and our great cheerleader, Annette Lamont. So thank you, Annette. I know Josh talked a lot about the Synod when he was here, so I'm not going to get real deep in the weeds of the Synod, but I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A because I think that's very much on the top of so many Catholics' minds, not just here in this country, but around the world, because it is very exciting. So what I want to do is really kind of zoom out this morning and talk about Pope Francis's reform, but also the resistance to it. Because here's the reality. Pope Francis has been Pope for 11 years. He's 87 years old, and he's in declining health. He's mentally sharp, almost frighteningly so. He recently told me I was evil when I was joking with him about something. But what we've seen over the last 2 years is a real decline in his physical abilities, and that puts everyone on edge because there's this big question looming over things in Rome about what comes next. Now, Pope Francis likes to joke that you don't need legs to run the church, you just need a brain. And that's certainly true because he has that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. And so in talking about his reforms and resistance, I hope I can kind of give you a sense of some of the major themes that are being discussed in the life of the church that are important to its future. When I was here a year ago, we were just a few days out from the 10-year anniversary of his election as Pope. Now, you'd be forgiven if you thought that was an important day at the Vatican. Normally, Vatican officials love to go all out with any sort of celebration. So, if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to run over here to advance the slides. This is a photo of U.S. Cardinal Raymond Burke celebrating his 70th birthday a few years ago in Rome. You can see the cake, the candlelight dinner, the crowds. There was also a fireworks show that followed. Greg, do you mind advancing to the next slide? This was Pope Francis celebrating his 80th birthday. He had invited the homeless of Rome to come to the Vatican to have breakfast with him. And the same was true last March 13th when Pope Francis celebrated his 10-year anniversary. He had a small private mass at the Vatican with the cardinals, and there wasn't even a lunch that followed, which, you know, in Italian terms is really brutta figura. I mean, you can't have a celebration without Prosecco. It's just anathema, so. But I want to rewind to 11 years ago in those few weeks before the election of Pope Francis. It was 2013, and many of you will recall the church was still in shock over that surprise resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. He was the first pope in nearly 600 years to voluntarily step down. And ahead of every conclave, before the cardinals head into the Sistine Chapel to cast their secret votes, the cardinals meet for a series of meetings known as the General Congregations. This is a period where they discuss major issues in the life of the church and what they'd like to see in the next pope. It's not exactly the Iowa caucuses, but I think you can get the idea. It's where all these things are kind of brought to the table. And these are private meetings. We journalists aren't allowed inside, but over time, details drip out about what was discussed and by whom. And what we know during those meetings was that there was a lot of discussion about the church's finances. Some of you may recall that at the time, the Vatican was facing potential money laundering charges from the European Union. Not exactly great for an institution that's supposed to be known for its transparency. There was the challenge of clergy abuse, which was rightly discussed quite a bit in those days. And in general, most of the discussion focused on the Vatican's disorganized, chaotic, nepotistic bureaucracy. That's what topped the agenda. And during one of those sessions, then Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina gave a 4-minute speech. He agreed that everything that had been said was all true, but he warned against simply relying on a bureaucratic or technical fix to the broken system. Instead, he talked about the passage from the Gospel of Luke that describes a woman who'd been crippled by an evil spirit, unable to stand up straight after 18 years. Bergoglio said that the church had a self-referential spirit and often a clericalist mentality that had crippled it and made it unable to carry about its mission. I'm going to quote a bit from what he said in those remarks. He said that the church is, quote, called to come out of herself and go to the peripheries, not only geographically, but also to the existential peripheries, and speak to the mystery of pain and injustice in the world. When the church does not come out of herself to evangelize, she becomes self-referential and then gets sick. The evil that over time happens in ecclesial institutions have their root in self-referentiality and a kind of theological narcissism, he said. Final quote. The self-referential church keeps Jesus Christ within herself and does not let him out. Now, this was a speech that was 4 minutes, and I think it's fair to say that it's a speech that changed church history, because it was in that moment that multiple cardinals would later point to when they realized that they had their man as the next pope. A few days later, he would go on to be elected and take Francis as his name. And I go back to that speech because I think it tells us a lot about who Francis is and what his priorities are, and it's provided a bit of a blueprint for the last 11 years of his papacy. I think it tells us what really animates him as a church leader. He strongly believed that the church had to re-examine its priorities, the way it communicates and lives out the mission, which is primarily to preach the gospel. That's the name that he titled the new Vatican Constitution that came out 2 years ago. Preach the Gospel was the name of the document that reorganized all of the Vatican departments so that that would be the central task. But if you read between the lines of that speech, I think you can also begin to detect why there's been such fierce resistance to Francis in certain pockets of the church. This was a speech that challenged the status quo. It challenged those who thought of that Rome should be the center of the Catholic Church, issuing decrees from on high where everyone else was just supposed to fall in line. It was also a speech that called for humility in an institution that's not always been known for that. In his push to go to the peripheries, we can already detect Francis's desire for greater decentralization in the church, both in terms of maximizing pastoral flexibility and creativity so that bringing the gospel to people would be the central role of pastors, not being enforcers of the law. And I think this is sort of the critical point to realize, that the primary thing motivating Francis is not just the vision of a more progressive church. That would be too simplistic. For Francis, it's not a traditional or conservative church versus a more liberal church. And I think to interpret Francis through a political lens cheapens what he's up to. I think to understand the resistance is to best understand it by the divides in the church being over whether or not the church should be open to the world around it or closed off. These debates about Francis is about whether the church should be a shelter or a fortress. Now, that's not entirely a new thing. That was, in fact, one of the motivating principles of the Second Vatican Council, to, quote, open up the windows of the church of the world around it. Now, Greg, do you mind advancing, actually in the back, go back. The slides are slightly out of order. One more. Thank you. This is a photo from last October 12th, just over a week into the Synod, where 400 delegates from all over the world had made their way to Rome. And they went here on a field trip to the outskirts of Rome, to the catacombs of St. Sebastian and St. Callistus, outside near the Appian Way. I've told Father Greg that when he comes to visit me in Rome, we're going to go biking out there. It's a wonderful area of Rome. This was an informal field trip meant to take the Synod participants back to the roots of the Christian faith, down to the catacombs where the relics of both St. Peter and St. Paul had been taken and hidden for some time to safeguard them from persecution and vandalism. The Synod delegates were also shown the miles and miles of underground burial sites for Christians of the early church. It was an egalitarian system where Christians of all social and economic backgrounds were buried together despite whatever classes they came from. And at the back of the prayer service booklet that all the synod delegates had been given was a text called the Pact of the Catacombs. It was a largely unknown text to many people. Now, in November of 1965, some 40 bishops that had been participating in the Second Vatican Council had gathered nearby at some other catacombs quite close to where those delegates had gathered just last October. There, some 100,000 Christians had been buried during the first centuries. And at that Mass, as it concluded in 1965, these bishops went up to the altar one by one and signed this Pact of the Catacomb, committing themselves to take the aims of the Second Vatican Council and to live it in their own lives and ministries. And in particular, they wanted to be a church for the poor. Those 42 bishops there gathered that night committed to, quote, to be a more humanly present, more welcoming, to be more faithful to the Spirit of Jesus in the service of the poor, to renounce privileges, to promote justice, charity, collegiality, and communion with the people of God. Now, regrettably, that pact was largely forgotten, at least by a lot of church leaders in the West. But in the global South, it was kept alive, especially by the church leaders who helped shape Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio. So it was no surprise then, thinking back on the Pact of the Catacombs, that during Francis's 4-minute speech before he was elected Pope, he turned to so many of those same themes that were talked about in the Catacombs Pact. Or when a few days after he had been elected, he told reporters that his chief dream was of, quote, a poor church for the poor. For Francis, the visit of the synod delegates to the catacombs, to the birthplace of the early church, served as a reminder that if the church is to be reborn and reformed, it must recover the aims and the priorities of a church that, in the words of the catacombs, is close to its people and open to all. Now, we can ask ourselves, how is this all playing out? And we know that over the last decade, Pope Francis has used synodality as his major reform vehicle in the church, in an effort to make the church more participatory, more inclusive, and less clerical. Synodality has completely changed the way the church tackles critical topics in the life of the church and its people. If you go back to the Pope's first 2 synods on the theme of the family, the major questions were how the church might become more responsive to the concrete needs of modern family life. In fact, the Pope said that his inspiration for calling that synod was after reading a book on the subject of mercy. That's why the question of communion for divorced and remarried Catholics had become a major flashpoint during that synod. Now, I think contrary to many critics, the Pope wasn't looking to overhaul church doctrines or church commitments to the family, but rather explore how the church might expand its ministry of mercy to those in need, and hence his final decision to provide an opening for communion for divorced and remarried Catholics. Or fast forward to the Amazon Synod in 2019. This was an assembly to address the needs of the massive 9-nation Amazon region, where many of the church's indigenous live without regular access to the sacraments. It's for this reason that the questions of women deacons and married clergy emerged during that synod, not because the Pope was simply trying to fulfill some sort of campaign promise the way that politicians do, but because the Pope wanted to consider how the church might be particularly present and pastorally responsive to the needs of those in the Amazon region. And of course, who can forget December 18th, wherein the Pope signed off on a declaration where he allowed for the pastoral blessings for those in gay relationships or, quote, irregular situations, as the church calls it. This is an effort on behalf of Francis to maximize pastoral outreach. As the document said, quote, moral perfection, something no one is capable of, should not be a condition for receiving a blessing from a minister of the church. And if we want to look even beyond pelvic issues, I think it's that same pastoral outreach that motivates Francis's approach, which is quite controversial, to China. In 2018, the Holy See entered into a much criticized agreement with China over the appointment of bishops in that country. Now, I think whatever criticisms one wants to make of the particulars of that deal, the motivation for Francis isn't geopolitical. It's because Francis is painfully aware that China is the second most populous country on earth, and that they need shepherds and bishops. He's trying to have a way of dialogue with those in that country. This concern is also why Francis has become almost obsessed with the question of seminary formation in recent years. During the synod last October, we know that the Pope spoke only 2 or 3 times from the floor in unscripted remarks. And at least on 2 of those occasions, his remarks focused on seminary formation and the need to rid the church of clericalism and train priests to be in better service to their people. And in fact, one of those remarks were published. Here's what he had to say. I just want to read a few passages because they're quite colorful. He says, "Clericalism is a whip. It's a scourge. It is a form of the worldliness that defiles and damages the face of the Lord's bride. It enslaves God's holy and faithful people." Then he went on to describe it as a scandal, the scene of young priests and seminarians in Rome going around to tailor shops, trying on cassocks and hats with lace. I think for Francis, when he sees this, it's an image or a vision of a church that is self-referential, not that of a field hospital with the primary aim of providing mercy to those on the front lines. Now, some of you may be saying, this all sounds great and lofty, but these reforms are taking too long. And I think that's a fair concern. Some of you may be wondering why there are bishops in Africa who still support the criminalization of homosexuality when the Pope has come out strongly against it. But that resistance to Francis isn't even an ocean away. There are plenty of people in this country that have protested when, in 2018, Francis declared the death penalty to be inadmissible. There are others, perhaps in this room, that wonder why nearly 10 years after the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, saying that the Catholic Church accepted the scientific consensus on climate change, that most Catholic dioceses in this country have not taken any steps toward actually implementing it. But I'd suggest that for a Catholic Church that is used to thinking and moving in centuries, that there are some signs of hope that reform is underway. Father Greg, do you mind advancing forward to, there we go. I want to go back to 2019, to the eve of the Synod on the Amazon. There were 185 delegates at that synod that would have a vote, including a religious brother. And that's important because it meant that someone who was not ordained as a priest or bishop would have a vote at that synod. Now, there had been a handful of women that had been invited to attend. Most of them were representing religious congregations, but the women were not given a vote. And it was an understandably frustrating situation. Women have the same status in the church as non-ordained men, but non-ordained men had been given a right to vote, but the women had not. Now, just days before that synod, a group of several dozen women gathered in front of the Vatican Synod office on the Via della Conciliazione. That's that long, iconic road that leads to St. Peter's that I'm sure many of you have walked down yourself. These women gathered and they held signs, they chanted, they prayed, and they even projected lights on the doors of the Vatican Synod office that simply said, "Votes for Catholic women." Now, among those women there that day was a woman by the name of Helena Jeppesen. She's a lay pastoral worker in Switzerland who's worked in the church for decades, particularly providing foreign relief services for the Swiss church. And Jeppesen left Rome really vexed by what she'd viewed as a real injustice at that synod. But she was also determined, so that when Pope Francis announced that the next synod would be a multi-years process that took place first through local listening sessions across the globe, then followed by national and continental assemblies, and then finally meetings in Rome, she really poured herself into that process, confident that the church could and should change. Last October, when the Synod of Bishops began in Rome, Jeppesen was no longer standing outside of the doors of the Synod office. She was inside the Synod as one of 54 women who, for the first time ever, had been given the right to vote at the Synod. Do you mind advancing? You can see them behind me. These are most of the women delegates. As we started calling them during the Synod, they became known as the Synod Mothers. During the final week of the Synod, my colleague Josh McElwee had Helena on our podcast. And I want to read you some of Helena's words that describe her experience. She says, quote, "What I see as symbol for the future is when we were here in 2019, there was a group of Swiss sisters and sisters from Europe standing in front of the Synod office, and we had a small symposium on the right of religious to vote in the Synod because it wasn't possible yet. In only 4 years after that, the doors of the Synod office were open for everybody, and we were able to go there and discuss our issues. This is a symbol for me," she said. "Let's open more doors for women in the Catholic Church." Now, Helena's appointment to the Synod isn't the only one. In 2018, Sister Nathalie Bécard of France was one of the delegates at the Synod on Young People. In just a few short years, she went from being a non-voting delegate at that Synod to the #2 official at the Vatican Synod office, having a voice and a vote, not just in the Vatican and at the Synod, but now having one of the highest titles of rank in the Vatican. Do you mind advancing? You can now see her behind me sitting at the Pope's table during the Synod. I'll give you another example. The day after the Synod ended, I had lunch with the Ghanaian theologian Nora Nantera, who was one of only 2 lay women from Africa that took part in the Synod. Mind advancing? I had met Nora some years ago, I think in 2018, in Nigeria, and I'd been really impressed by the fact that she didn't mince words when she spoke in the presence of bishops. She put things really bluntly. But she also spoke at one of the press conferences at the Synod, and she impressed a number of my colleagues when she was asked to describe her experience. And this is what she had to say, quote, "I felt listened to as a layperson, as a woman, and as an African in a church that most often has not given that voice, a church that has not had a chance to enrich itself with the voice and wisdom from women, from lay people, and especially from Africans. I come to the Synod with the hopes, the joys, the dreams, the anxieties, the lamentations, but also the resilience of African women, lay people from the continent, and in fact the entire church that might not always get to sit at the center of discourse." When I asked her to elaborate on this a few days later, we began to discuss the African tradition of palaver, which is the ancient custom where families, tribes, or communities that they use in Africa to work through disagreements. This takes on different forms depending on where it's located, but the idea is roughly the same. It's that when there's a dispute, the members of a family or a tribe gather under the palaver tree. The elders are invited in order to share their wisdom, but young people are also invited in so that they have an equal say and participation to share new perspectives and new ideas. What's always understood is that however grave or serious the disagreements, there are deeper ties that bind them that must remain. Everyone gathered is a part of one family, and those bonds can't be severed. Through collective discernment, a greater wisdom emerges. Reflecting on that tradition in light of the month-long Synod in Rome, Nora's words to me were simple and profound. Quote, "My village has long practiced synodality. Now my church is finally doing so too." Now, around the 10-year anniversary of Francis's election last year, he gave an interview where he reflected on a decision that he made in the early months of his papacy, not to spend his summer holidays at Castel Gandolfo. Now, Castel Gandolfo is only about 15 miles outside of Rome, but for about 400 years, popes have been going there to escape the summer heat, which is pretty brutal in Rome. And for a lot of people, they just saw that decision that the Pope made as something quite simple that reflected his own preferences not to take a holiday. But I think for Francis, there was a lot of symbolic weight behind that decision, because in one of the anniversary interviews that he gave, he was reflecting on this, and he said, Castel Gandolfo was sort of a bit like a court, and he compared it to the royal family moving from London up to Scotland during the summer times. And he says, you know, the papal monarchy is the absolute court, the last absolute court left in Europe. He said, "My vision for the papacy is, quote, to remove all appearances of a court and to give it what is really a pastoral service." I think this dismantling of the papal court, or the papal monarchy as he's called it, has ruffled a lot of feathers. It's rattled the princes of the church who've been used to their jobs, their perks, their titles, and all that goes along with it. And in this paradigm shift of going from a church focused on power to a church focused on pastoral outreach, it's ignited fierce backlash from within, both in this country and in Rome. I don't think there's any greater example of that than U.S. Cardinal Raymond Burke, whose birthday party you saw earlier, who last December, Pope Francis announced that he was taking away some of his cardinal privileges. In making way for the Helenas or the Noras of the world, and in reclaiming the vision outlined in the catacombs, I think Francis is staking his legacy for not just the type of church that he wants to build, but the type of people he wants to be leading the way. You advance to the next slide. Thank you. During the final days of the synod, this above photo caught a lot of attention. It's of 19-year-old Wyatt Olivius from Wyoming. Now, he was the youngest member of the synod, and during one of the coffee breaks, he approached Pope Francis with a request. He asked the Pope to sign a permission slip to excuse him from missing classes for the month. And the Pope obliged. After he received the permission slip back from the Pope, Wyatt gave the Pope something in return. It was a small white business card with 2 words on it that were printed that just said, quote, "You matter." He later explained that it was a tradition that had started in high school to remind people that they were not forgotten and that they mattered, that he and his friends would do. When they were having a bad day, they would just give him this card. This is what he had to say, quote, "I think sometimes you forget that the Pope is human too. So I wanted to give him a note as well, saying, you matter." In reflecting on the synod experience, Wyatt said that despite his youth, he was taken seriously by all of the bishops and cardinals that he'd rubbed shoulders with over the last month. And indeed, he felt like the Pope had taken him seriously as well. He said, quote, "I think that's important in our whole church, to take the young people seriously. We're here and we want responsibility." Just a few days later, at the final Mass for the Synod in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis said that now was the time for the church to dream. His dream, he said, is, quote, "A church that is a servant of all, the servant of the least of our brothers and sisters, a church that never demands an attestation of good behavior, but welcomes, serves, loves, and forgives, a church with open doors that is a haven of mercy." I think for the likes of Wyatt, I think that's a dream of the church that through its pastoral outreach says, you matter, or as Father Paul said this morning, of a church that calls people and shows them that they're listened to and they're respected. The question is whether or not that is more than a fleeting dream and can become a more permanent reality. And that, I think, will be the essential question in the next conclave to come. So on that happy note, let's have some questions.
What I'll do is just, if you raise your hand and I'll walk the mic around, so you can be speaking while I walk back to Barbara. This experience, conclave coming up, do you think that the church can go back to conclave that looks very differently demographically?
I'll say 2 things. One, the day after the synod, I don't know if you were aware, I'm sure Josh talked about it, that during the synod, the delegates were asked not to give interviews and to use some discretion about how they talked with the reporters during it because they wanted to build an atmosphere of trust. And so there were a number of people in that room that didn't feel comfortable talking until after the synod was over. But Josh and I interviewed Cardinal McElroy of San Diego and Cardinal Supich of Chicago. And in that interview, they both said, this has marked a turning point and there is no going back in how the church operates. So on a certain hand, I think they see with a lot of confidence that church structures are changing, that there are new mechanisms involved that invites fuller participation of the people of God, that it's not just bishops and cardinals. So that's on the plus side, perhaps. What else might be also considered on the plus side is that as of today, the Pope has named about 73% of the men who will elect his successors. which is quite sizable, and I think it's very likely that he'll probably name cardinals again next October or sometime before the end of this year. That will only increase the number of cardinals that he's named. Now, he's named men that come from various remote pockets of the globe, places that have never had a cardinal before. And the thing about them, they're known for their pastoral outreach. That's why the Pope tapped them to become cardinals. But we don't really know where they stand on a lot of hot-button questions because they don't have a great body of literature that you can go back and look at. And so there are big question marks that hang over a number of the cardinals just to where they stand on a lot of the critical issues. So I would say there's no surefire bet that the next conclave is going to produce someone in the mold just like Francis. My own prediction is that generally they will look for someone who wants to continue the reforms of Francis, but perhaps be a bit more disciplined and not as surprising as Pope Francis is. But that's just my hunch. So.
Sure if this is, I'm not, is that
yeah.
on? Okay. Building on what, thank you. Building on what you and Father Greg have just said, do you think that there's enough energy in the laity of the church to continue what Pope Francis is his reforms?
My experience with the synodal process, and I was very fortunate that during the synodal process I was able to go and do some reporting from Africa, where in Kenya alone, in Nairobi, not just Kenya, in Nairobi alone, they had over 5 million people participate in it. And I was able to go to Australia, where they had their own plenary council that really fueled momentum for the synodal process. That the problem really isn't with the laity. I think most of the laity are chomping at the bit to be involved. The name of the document is, of the continental document of the synod process was titled "Enlarge the Space of Our Tent." And I think from the ground up, there's a lot of desire and movement to see that tent expanded. It's just about how quickly it can be done. And the challenge, I think, is not that the lack of participants, but can it happen fast enough without a sort of synodal fatigue setting in for those that feel like, this reform is too slow. That, I think, is the real challenge. But I think the spirit is moving. People are eager to see this happen. So.
You mentioned Pope Francis is interested in decentralizing the pastoral roles instead of having the pastors be more serving as law enforcers. Is he concerned that, actually, what are some limiting factors of decentralizing? Because I would imagine if you decentralize too much, you just create a whole other denomination. Is he concerned?
So I think decentralization looks very differently. So first, maybe I'll start with the perspective from Rome. So many of you are probably familiar that roughly every 5 years or so, although it's gotten dragged out a bit, so it's more like every 7 or 8 years, each bishop's conference from around the world go to Rome to meet with the Pope and the heads of other Vatican offices. And one of the Pope's main tasks in these visits, known as the ad limina visits, is to put the service of the Roman Curia toward the service of the whole church. So under John Paul II, under Benedict, basically these meetings would take place where the bishops would come to Rome and they'd go into a Vatican department and they would get lectured about everything they were doing wrong. And I've had bishops that are not very fond of Francis tell me that these meetings are totally different now, where they go into these meetings and the Pope and other Vatican departments say, how can we help you? So I think that's part of decentralization, so that the Vatican is not just top-down saying, this is what you should be doing. On the local level, I think it's to maximize pastoral flexibility and creativity. So, I mean, the thing that's remarkable is, the Pope's critics would like to say he's going soft on marriage and family or complain about this and that. The Pope has not changed any bit of church doctrine. What he's tried to do, I think, is to expand the space in which pastors in particular can do that, can be just that, pastors, and meet those concretely where they are, particularly divorced, remarried Catholics, LGBTQ Catholics. Like I said, the situation in China where the Pope has entered this controversial deal with China, just providing ways in which there can be shepherds on the front line. I think that is what's motivating and animating him, much more so than any ideological motivation.
In addition to praying for him, are there other ways that we can provide the Pope with emotional support directly along the lines of giving him a You Matter card?
It's a good question. You know, when Pope Francis first started having issues with his knee, and I was writing about him having to cancel events on how, because he was having trouble walking and getting treatment for the knee, I probably got over 100 emails from people writing to me suggesting various exercises that the Pope should be doing. So that's something practical some people were doing. I mean, the Pope ends every single address that he gives with, "Please do not forget to pray for me." And in recent years, he started saying, particularly when he addresses groups in which that may not be Catholic or it may be younger people, he says, "And if you don't pray, send good vibes my way." I think that is the top of his agenda. But I think in this country, there is, a lot of resistance to Francis because I think social media platforms play an exacerbated role in shaping the discourse around this Pope. And I think, encouraging people to read what the Pope is actually saying before they form opinions about him would be a first place to start. Obviously, you should all be reading National Catholic Reporter so that you can get your best briefing. But really understanding what the Pope is doing by reading his own words, I think, is a way of showing support. So those are just practical things. So. And not contributing to the online debates. So.
You mentioned the Pope's focus on the seminary and the preparation of priests for, particularly to be pastors. If you look at that over realistically, if you're waiting for new priests to change the world, it's going to take centuries. I mean, there's a shortage of priests, and it's a slow process to replace them. So my question is there anything going on at the Vatican level to recognize that they have to reach the priests that are in place and get them to buy into this process, or it's just not going to happen?
Yeah. I'd say it's a slow-moving process. One oversight of the Synod process, which they're now trying to compensate for, there were only a handful of parish priests in the room at the Synod. I think there were maybe only 2. And so to compensate for that, in May, they're having a big symposium of, I think it's roughly 400 priests from all over around the world to basically meet for a week and go through the synodal experience of the sort of listening sessions and conversations in the Spirit so that these priests can then go back home and implement it in their own diocese. But it's an uphill climb. I would say this is why I think the Pope is quite concerned about it, because he sees priests being on the front lines, and when not all of them are on board, that really, what's the expression, that fish rot from the head down? That's the problem. So I don't want to just give you words of discouragement, but the reality is, and as a journalist, I think it's important to speak truth, this is one of the major missing steps, and there's very little that you can do quickly enough.
Thank you, first of all. A couple of questions. The first one is, in the United States, Spain, the Spanish culture. Okay. The Spanish culture dominated the western part of the United States and church. I was curious on the countries that dominated Africa, southern Africa, northern Africa was very ancient, but the current African situation, what countries dominated that area, and who was behind the seminaries?
Sure.
And the second thing is, where are the United States bishops we only see conflict usually between Pope Francis and them. Where do they agree?
Well, I'll start with the first question. On the African front, I'd say, it's often said demographically that the future of the church is African. We see it from the numbers. The world's largest Catholic seminary is in Enugu, Nigeria. And in fact, Nora, the Ghanaian theologian that I showed earlier in reference, I met her at a conference at Enugu, and I think it was 2018 or 2019, and they were having a big theological symposium of theologians from all over Africa. What we've seen in the last, I'd say, 5 years is the real push for African theologians to really network among themselves and build up their own community. Because so far most of the work that they've done has been going to Europe or going to the United States or coming to the United States to do theology. And I think there is this felt realization that they're also needed at home. And that is something that's in its nascent stages. And then I want to say, obviously, in terms of where else the church is growing, I mean, it's growing all over Africa. I think back to last January and February when I traveled to the Democratic Republic of Congo with Pope Francis, which by 2050, I believe, will be in the top 5 most Catholic countries in the world. And I've never seen anything like it. When the Pope landed at the airport in Kinshasa, from the time it took him to go from the airport to the presidential palace, it was about, I think, 14 or 15 miles. And just rows and rows, I can't begin to describe to you how far back of people lining the streets. 2 million people at Mass, joyful, vibrant, and even the most stone-hearted of reporters were moved by just the joy and vibrancy of the church there. And that was a trip that most people thought would get ignored by the secular press, and it managed to be on the front page of the New York Times 3 days in a row because I think everyone was just shocked by what they were witnessing. So, and you had a second question about the U.S. bishops. And on the U.S. bishops, I would say, the U.S. Bishops' Conference has really struggled to get on board with Pope Francis. If you look at their strategic plan, it's hard to detect a real influence from Francis. They don't draw heavily from the Pope's major encyclicals. That being said, the past few days I was down in San Diego at a conference of U.S. bishops and theologians and church leaders on the topic of Laudato Si', the Pope's climate encyclical, and they were taking stock of the fact that about 10 years after the document came out, they've failed to act on this and sort of having a reckoning with themselves as to what they can do to better implement this. So I'd say there is movement, there are pockets of bishops that are trying to bring the church more in line with Francis, but it's a tough process. To go back to Tom's point about the priests, it also is true with the bishops. It's a thin bench to choose from when they're identifying new bishops. So that's the reality as well. So.
Thanks, Chris. Are you aware of any intentional reform of the narrative to be more welcoming and inclusive of the younger population across the world and even here in the United States? For example, the narrative around being more inclusive and welcoming for Gen Zers or even those of the younger age to promote just meeting them where they're at, and so that we would see just like more diversity across the Catholic congregation. Thank you.
Maybe because I was just at this conference on climate change and Laudato Si', the first thing that comes to mind as I'm processing your question is a talk that was given by someone there that got a lot of attention that said, one of the things that tops every bishop's agenda is pastoral outreach to young people. It's, as a bishop saying, it's what keeps me up at night. How do we keep our young people, how do we prevent against losing them? And they felt that one of the ways the church has to act is to be more credible on climate, because it was a way to show young people that the church cares about the issues that they care about. So that was just something that comes to mind. perhaps because of the past few days. I'd say that there are efforts, in 2018 there was the Youth Synod at the Vatican where Pope Francis had, basically 300 delegates from around the world specifically focus on this theme of young people. But I'd say most of the energy has been through sort of programming, such as putting, a lot of energy and effort behind things like World Youth Day, where a million young people from around the world gather every 3 or 4 years in a particular city. But it hasn't really seeped down into the grassroots in the way that is really maybe felt or detectable. So because I don't cover the U.S. church closely, I don't know what the most active or vibrant ministries are in this country. But I would say in Rome, it tends to be through big programmatic activities like World Youth Day.
So you described the growing population of Catholics in Africa, but that's also a very conservative group of Catholics at all levels, I think. And so how is that going to work out in terms of the future direction of the church, where you have more liberal Catholics in Europe, but also an aging population of parishioners, but more conservative church growing elsewhere? So it's hard for me to be totally optimistic about the direction that Francis sets out.
Yeah, we saw in the backlash to Fiducia Supplicans, the document on December 18th on gay blessings, that it was, just 3 weeks after that the bishops of Africa released a document saying no blessings for gay couples in Africa. So Africa has really been the continent driving the resistance to this front. I'd say a few things. One, the African bishops don't speak for the African church as a whole, and that if you read the African synodal reports that came out of every country in Africa, they look a lot like they look a lot like the synod reports that came out of France, and they look a lot like the reports that came out of the United States or the reports that came out of Argentina. The same concerns surface. So if you include all of the people of God, you get a much broader perspective than if you just listen to those at the top. So I say that knowing that that's going to give you great hope, but perhaps it gives you some hope. So, yeah.
Can you compare or contrast the U.S. Conference bishops' stance compared to the Pope's policies on immigration?
Yeah, I actually think this is one area where the U.S. bishops and the Pope are quite aligned. I think if you look at the actions of the U.S. bishops on migration, they're almost unanimous in support and on the side of migrants and calling for comprehensive immigration reform in a way that welcomes, protects, and integrates new arrivals. So on this front, and there was a lot of hope in 2016 around the election of President Trump that because the bishops were united on migration as a conference, that it might bring them closer to Francis. Unfortunately, I don't think that's actually been the case. They still, I think, are quite strong on migration. If you go along the border, I think there are 9 dioceses along the U.S.-Mexico border. Not all of those bishops are homogenous in the way they think or speak, but they're strongly on the side of migrants. So I think that is a sign of real unanimity, and in which the Pope would really praise the U.S. Church for its strong record on migration. In fact, one of the bishops that the Pope cites the most in this country when he's just talking extemporaneously is Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, Texas, because of Seitz's work on migration. Seitz is known as one of the strongest border bishops out there, and you wouldn't call him a progressive. So I think this is a real area where there is quite a bit of harmony.
Just thank you for your presentation. It's wonderful. A couple of quick points. You mentioned the pastoral approach, really, of Francis throughout his time, and how he hasn't really changed church doctrine. And this is one of the things that sometimes worries me, is that you have the blessing of people in irregular relationships, and yet we don't change the language of that comes in the canons, and we don't change the rules in terms of how we see people. We don't change the ecclesial structures that allow for the way bishops are selected, for example, or the ordination of women as deacons, the reintroduction of the ordination of women as deacons. My question is, do you think coming out of the second session of the Synod, this is your prognostication, do you think there will be more movements to make really changes to the structures and not simply changes in practice?
I think there has to be. I think on these questions, millions of Catholics from around the world have participated in the Synod process, and the expectations are high. And the Pope himself has called for a re-examining of structures. That's in the final synthesis report. I think on the question of deacons, I suspect the way the Pope wants to act is the issue of deacons, obviously, as I mentioned, came up in a big, big way during the Synod on the Amazon. And in the apostolic exhortation that the Pope wrote that followed that, the Pope did not close the door on the question of women deacons. He kept it open. But the first thing he did was he green-lighted the formation of the ecclesial conference in the Amazon, which functions like a bishop's conference, but it has lay people. It's run by lay people with the right to vote, and they can make requests on certain issues. And I suspect the Pope is waiting for them to request locally to be able to ordain women and married clergy in the Amazon and to greenlight it, rather than provide one blanket solution, but to handle this in a location-specific way. So I'd say on the married clergy issue, on women deacons, I think this is the way the Pope tends to operate. I think he's waiting for the ecclesial body of the Amazon to ask him for that, and that I don't think that would come until after the Synod completes its work. Look, you've had a number of prominent cardinals call for the removal of the language of intrinsically disordered. I think that's something the Pope has not been directly asked about that by journalists, but I suspect that's something that he would be in favor of. I suspect also that on the question of bishops' appointments, and I think we're going to see a major overhaul in how that's done following the Synod as well. I mean, one of the things that the Synod synthesis document says is bishops need to be evaluated on job performance. And if they can be evaluated for job performance, then that also tends to suggest that they could be removed for job performance, which is something you don't see. So.
Thank you for a fabulous presentation. In 1978, 79, John Paul was elected the first non-Italian pope in centuries, and then Pope Francis, even though he's ethnically Italian, he represents South America. What are the possibilities or probabilities of a pope, an indigenous pope or a pope of color in this next election or the pope after that?
My least favorite question. No, I hate looking into the crystal ball. I tend to think, as I mentioned earlier, that the cardinals will want someone to carry on Pope Francis's reforms, broadly speaking, but want someone with a temperament that is perhaps a bit more Roman in style, meaning cautious, that respects the court a bit, unfortunately. And this is going to be a conclave where you're going to have cardinals who don't really know each other. They're going to be getting to know each other and kind of kicking the tires a bit during those general congregations. And someone that goes in with a lot of name recognition is probably going to just be the automatic favorite because of that. And because of that reality, I suspect you're probably going to get a European. So I think the cardinals are quite reluctant to go anywhere that hasn't had, to any country that has not had a serious reckoning with clergy abuse, because it's a great risk to name someone as pope that has not, in a sense, been vetted thoroughly on that issue. And the countries that have dealt with that most thoroughly have been the United States, Europe, and Australia.
We are at an hour and 5, so maybe a couple more questions. Yep.
One of the things you said early on was that Francis doesn't necessarily regard his spirit of reform as being right or left politically, but part of the title of the talk is The Resistance. Yeah. Does the resistance view it politically? I kind of have the impression that perhaps it does. And I have a practical question for you, in addition to just addressing that, is as an NCR reporter, do you feel like you have a good access and insight to, for instance, the court of Benedict? You know, I know you're talking about Francis dismembering his court, but I think there's a good sense that there's other folks out there.
Those are great questions. On the political question, I think particularly by U.S. Catholics, the divisions do tend to fall along political lines. At the Vatican, however, I think the resistance is far less along sort of political or theological lines, but it is the reform of the court. And in removing people from their position, in sort of taking away some of the perks, frankly, making it a less glamorous lifestyle or job, that fuels the resistance. It doesn't matter if you're right or perceived to be on the right or on the left. It's the fact that they're now having to pay rent for their apartments. That really upsets a lot of people. Now, I often do like to remind people, I think Francis has, over the course of 10 years, finally, just as maybe as of a year ago, gotten his own government in place. So if you look at the heads of every department, they are pretty much led by people in line with Francis. The challenge is with the level of middle managers, and that's something that the Pope has far less influence over, and that's where you have a lot of, for lack of a better term, holdover employees that can just kind of remain in the system unchallenged. And unless you have a department head who's willing to reform their own house from within, you know, a lot of people are fine just buying their time and waiting, you know, keeping their powder dry until a new guy comes along and to see what he's all about. So I think that's the reality. As far as your second question, it's a very good one. I mean, the editorial line of the National Catholic Reporter obviously skews left, and that's no secret. And in fact, the paper is quite proud of that. I think it's my job to talk with absolutely everyone in the Vatican and everyone in the church. And I'll just tell you this, there's one person that works quite high up in the Vatican that I take out to lunch somewhat regularly, and he says, I love being able to stick the bill to NCR. But it's important, for me to talk to him to hear his perspective. So I think that any good reporter is going to talk to everyone. Any more questions? I feel like you're all here under duress from Annette, who made everyone come. So thank you, and especially on a day like today that is this beautiful for being inside. You're very kind of you.
So thank you very much. Chris, thank you very much for joining us. We're very honored that you're here with us. Given your position in the church and how well you know the church, it's a great gift to us. Lots of important issues which we hope to continue to discuss. I would encourage you to, if you don't have one, get a subscription to the NCR and we can discuss these issues together. So thank you all very much for being here. God bless you.